started as a dream life, a young couple, Michael and Sarah, wanted to escape the noise of the city. They saved up, bought a small piece of land in rural Montana, and built a modest cabin surrounded by towering pines. Their days were quiet, filled with the simple work of chopping wood, hunting, and gathering. At first, they loved the silence. No cars, no neighbors, just the wind whistling through the branches and the occasional cry of an owl at night. But that silence slowly began to change. The first odd thing happened in late autumn. Michael went out one morning to grab firewood and noticed the stack they had neatly arranged the day before was different. Some logs had been shifted, others taken from the middle and placed on top, like a child had been playing with them. He shrugged it off, assuming maybe Sarah had needed wood during the night. But when he asked her, she shook her head. She hadn't touched it. Weeks passed. Winter began to bite hard, snow covering the ground. That's when the footprints appeared. One morning, Sarah opened the door and froze. All around the cabin, in the fresh white snow, were boot prints. Not just one set, dozens. They circled the cabin in perfect loops, as if someone had walked around it over and over again while they slept. Michael followed the prints out into the woods, but they didn't lead to a road or another cabin. Instead, they wandered aimlessly between the trees until they suddenly stopped. No return trail, no sign of where the person had gone, just a pair of prints that ended in the middle of nowhere. Nights grew restless after that. Sometimes, just as they were drifting off to sleep, Sarah would nudge Michael. "Do you hear that?" From the trees came a faint sound, a whistle, not like birdsong, not like the wind, was too deliberate. 2 notes, rising and falling, as if someone was signaling. It always came from different directions, sometimes far, sometimes just beyond the tree line. Michael tried to laugh it off. Maybe a hunter, maybe kids playing tricks. But deep down, he knew no one lived for miles. One night, unable to sleep, Michael sat by the window with a lantern. Hours passed in silence. Then, just after midnight, the whistling started again. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, his breath clouding in the freezing air. The sound echoed through the trees, playful, mocking. He shouted into the night, demanding whoever it was to show themselves. The whistling stopped, and then silence. He waited, heart pounding, until finally he went back inside. Sarah was pale, terrified. "Michael," she whispered, "what if they were never trying to scare us? What if they're waiting for us to come out?" The couple tried to ignore it, but the tension grew unbearable. Sarah began covering the windows at night. Michael kept the rifle loaded, leaning against the door. Then came the night everything changed. Michael followed the tracks again the next morning, his time determined not to lose them. He trudged deep into the forest, the snow crunching under his boots. The trail wound between the trees, leading him farther than he'd ever gone before. Finally, he stopped at a tall, crooked pine. The tracks ended right there. He stared at the ground, confused. Then he looked up. Carved into the bark in jagged, uneven letters were the words, "I'm still watching." Michael stumbled back, his stomach turning. He sprinted all the way home, his breath ragged, his chest tight. Sarah listened in horror as he told her what he'd seen. That night, they barely slept. Every creak of the cabin felt like footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like someone whispering outside the walls. Days later, Sarah found something even worse. Pinned under the cabin's wooden steps was a piece of paper, damp and wrinkled from the snow, scrawled in messy handwriting with the words, "Don't leave. I like when you're here." The couple left within a week, abandoning their off-grid dream. They never found out who was stalking them in the woods, or how far the person went to watch them. But to this day, Sarah swears that sometimes, when the night is quiet, she can still hear it. That low, mocking whistle, rising and falling just beyond the trees. Some people move off-grid for peace. Others do it to escape? For David, it was both. He was in his late 30s, tired of the city, tired of people, and tired of bills piling up every month. So, when he inherited a small plot of desert land in Arizona, he decided to start over. He built a tiny solar-powered shack, barely big enough for a bed, a wood stove, and a shelf of canned food. He told himself it was freedom. Just him, the desert, and endless sky. And for the first few weeks, that's exactly what it felt like. The desert nights were like nothing he had ever experienced before. The silence was almost alive, so heavy that even the smallest sound carried forever. The crunch of his boots on gravel, the dry creak of shifting wood. Even his own breath seemed too loud, but it was peaceful until the lights appeared. It happened on a moonless night. David sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the horizon. That's when he noticed something moving across the flat desert land, tiny pinpricks of light, floating just above the ground. At first, he thought it must be headlights from a truck, but they didn't move like headlights. They drifted slowly, weaving back and forth. There was no road out there, just open desert. David set down his mug and squinted. The lights seemed to be getting closer. He waited, heart picking up speed. They weren't lanterns. They weren't flashlights. They didn't flicker like fire. They glowed, soft and steady, in shades of pale blue and white. Then he noticed something else. Silence. Total silence. No insects. No wind. No sound of shifting sand. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath. David whispered to himself, "What the hell is that?" The lights crept closer, moving in a slow arc until they hovered just outside his shack. Maybe 10, maybe 12 of them, each one about the size of a fist. They floated in place, swaying gently as if studying him. David stood frozen on the porch. His first thought was to grab his rifle, but something deep in his gut screamed at him not to move. The lights gave off no heat, no sound, just that eerie, steady glow. He didn't know how long they stayed there. Minutes, an hour. Time felt stretched, distorted. But just as suddenly as they appeared, the lights drifted backward, pulling away into the desert until they were swallowed by the darkness. David barely slept that night. He locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and sat with the rifle across his lap until morning. When the sun finally rose, he forced himself to believe it had been some kind of mirage. Maybe swamp gas, maybe headlights from some off-roaders in the distance, but the desert had other plans. The next morning, when David went outside, he stopped dead in his tracks. The tools he kept in his locked shed, his hammer, his axe, his wrench, even his shovel, were all missing. Panicked, he thought he'd been robbed. But then he saw them. Every single tool had been laid out carefully in the sand, arranged in a perfect circle around his shack. Not scattered, not dumped, placed. As if someone had stood there in the middle of the night, deliberately positioning each one while he slept inside. The lock on the shed wasn't broken. The door wasn't forced. It was as if the tools had simply passed through that night. David sat inside with all the lights off, watching the desert through his window. He didn't want the lights to know he was awake. But just after midnight, they came back. This time, there were more of them. He sat trembling in the dark as they glided silently around his shack, circling it again and again. He swore he could feel a faint hum, not in his ears, but deep in his chest, as if the air itself was vibrating. And then they stopped. All at once, every glowing orb froze outside his window. He felt the hair rise on his arms, his body screaming to run. Though there was nowhere to go, the lights hovered there for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, one by one, they faded out, until there was nothing but empty desert again. David left Arizona not long after that. He sold the shack to someone he never met in person, just a transaction. It's quick and clean. He doesn't talk much about what happened, but sometimes, when he's pressed, he'll say the same thing. They weren't headlights. They weren't lanterns, and they weren't human. Then he gets quiet. His eyes drift off, like he's still out there, sitting in the desert night, waiting for those lights to come back. Alaska is beautiful, but it's also merciless. The endless forests, the bitter cold, the silence that swallows you whole. It's not a place for the faint of heart. For Daniel, though, that isolation was the point. He'd spent years in crowded cities, suffocated by traffic, bills, and noise. So when he saved up enough, he bought a small piece of land hours outside of Fairbanks. No neighbors, no roads, just a log cabin he built by hand, sitting in the middle of frozen wilderness. At first, it was everything he wanted. The days were hard work splitting wood, melting snow for water, hunting game, but the nights were something else entirely. The first few nights were almost comforting. The wind howled against the cabin, and the fire cracked in the stove. He'd fall asleep, wrapped in blankets, feeling like the last person alive on Earth. But one night, deep in the dead of winter, he woke to something that was neither wind nor fire. A scream. At first, he thought it must have been an animal. Alaska was full of predators, wolves, mountain lions, even bears. But the sound was too sharp, too human. It cut through the night like glass breaking in his ear. Daniel sat up in bed, heart hammering, straining to listen. For a few minutes, there was nothing but silence. Then, again another scream. This time, it was closer. He grabbed his lantern and rifle, inching toward the window. The glass was rimmed with frost, his breath fogging the pane as he peered out. Nothing, just the white glow of snow under the moon. No movement, no figures, but then another scream. This time, behind the cabin, it was high-pitched, blood-curdling, and it didn't sound like fear. It sounded like pain. Daniel stayed frozen at the window until the sound stopped. Eventually, he convinced himself it had to be an animal, something caught in a trap, maybe. He forced himself back to bed, though sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, he stepped outside and walked the perimeter, scanning for tracks. The snow was fresh, untouched, not a single print. It was like the night before had never happened. For a few days, there was silence again. Daniel almost managed to forget. Almost then, 1 week later, the screams came back. This time, it didn't just come from one place. They moved, first from the east side of the cabin, then the west, then the tree line. It was as if something or someone was circling him in the dark, letting out those tortured cries as it moved. Daniel sat in the dark with his rifle in his lap, the lantern turned off. His only company was the sound of that screaming, weaving in and out of the night, sometimes near, sometimes far. He gritted his teeth, refusing to step outside. But when the sound finally stopped, hours later, he realized something even more terrifying. The final scream had come from directly beneath his window. By morning, he stumbled outside, desperate for proof tracks, claw marks, anything. But the snow was perfect, pristine. Only his own boot prints broke the surface. It didn't make sense. Something had been out there, something loud enough to wake him from a dead sleep. But it had left no sign of itself at all. The nights after that were torture. Daniel stopped sleeping. He sat with his rifle, staring into the black woods, waiting. The screams didn't come every night. Sometimes a week would pass, but when they returned, they always came in burst, moving, circling, taunting him, and he started to notice something else. They were getting closer. One night, he swore he could hear faint breathing outside the cabin wall, low and ragged, followed by a short, sharp cry that cut off as quickly as it began. He didn't dare open the door. He just sat, frozen, praying for dawn. When the sun rose, the snow was untouched. Again, by then, Daniel was breaking down. He hadn't spoken to another person in months. His food was running low, and the screaming, it was driving him insane. The final straw came one night when the screams erupted louder than ever, right outside his window. But this time, they didn't move. They stayed. Daniel sat rigid in his chair, every muscle locked as the sound went on and on for what felt like hours. A single, endless cry, inhuman and yet human, all the same. His lantern flickered. His fire burned low, and then, in the middle of the screaming, there was a knock on the door. 3 slow knocks. Daniel fled Alaska within the week. He packed what little he could carry, hiked to the nearest road, and never returned to that cabin. He doesn't like to talk about it. But when he does, his story never changes. He'll tell you about the nights in the wilderness, about the screams circling him like a predator, and about the silence and the snow afterward. But when people ask him what it was, he always shakes his head and says the same thing. Whatever it wasn't human. Some people dream of living alone in the woods, a quiet life, no neighbors, no traffic, no constant noise. For Claire, that dream was real. After years of working in a crowded city, she'd saved enough to buy a small, solar-powered cabin in the Ozarks. It was tucked away down a dirt road that barely counted as a road at all. One grocery store was 40 minutes away. The nearest neighbor, nearly 2 miles. It was solitude, pure and complete. Exactly what she thought she wanted. But isolation has a way of showing you things you don't expect. At first, everything seemed normal. The forest was alive during the day, full of bird calls and the rustle of leaves in the wind. At night, things grew quieter, but Claire found the silence comforting. She would sit by her wood stove, drink tea, and read until sleep overtook her. But after a few weeks, she began to notice something strange. It started with knocking. The first time, it was faint, a dull tap against the side of her cabin. She assumed it was a branch blowing in the wind, but when she stepped outside with her flashlight, the trees were still. The night perfectly calm. A week later, it happened again. This time, the sound was sharper, like knuckles against glass. Claire froze, the hair on her arms rising. She looked toward her windows but saw nothing. The moment she moved, the knocking stopped. By morning, she told herself it had to be animals, maybe raccoons, maybe woodpeckers. But something deep inside her didn't believe that. The third time, there was no mistaking it. Claire woke in the middle of the night, her throat dry. She turned toward the kitchen to grab water and stopped. There, in the pale glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains, was a face pressed against the glass of her living room window. It was only there for a second. A man's face, gaunt, pale, and smeared with dirt. His eyes stared straight into hers before vanishing back into the night. Claire screamed, stumbling backward. She grabbed a shotgun her father had insisted she keep and ran to the window, heart hammering. But outside, there was only darkness. The forest was silent, empty, as if nothing had been there at all. She barely slept that night, every creak of the cabin sounding like footsteps. The next morning, she found them tracks. They weren't boot prints. They weren't even shoes. They were bare feet pressed into the cold earth, circling her cabin. Whoever it was had walked barefoot in the night in freezing temperatures, leaving smudges against her windows with greasy, dirt-covered hands. Claire's stomach turned. Whoever it was hadn't just passed by. They'd been watching. For days, she tried to convince herself it had been a drifter, someone passing through. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they were desperate. She locked her doors, pulled curtains tight, and tried to move on. But the knocking returned, sometimes faint, sometimes loud, sometimes a slow, deliberate tap on the glass, and she was just about to fall asleep. She started leaving the lights on at night. She barely slept, and then came the night she'll never forget. It was just past midnight. Claire was lying in bed, shotgun by her side, when the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't at the window. It was at the door. 3 hard knocks, slow and steady, echoing through the small cabin. Her chest tightened. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. The knocks came again, closer, heavier, shaking the wood. Finally, she gathered enough courage to shout, "Get out of here. I'm armed." Silence. Then, from the kitchen window, another face, pressed against the glass. She swung the shotgun around, its finger trembling on the trigger. The face disappeared again, but she was sure of what she'd seen this time. The same man, dirt-covered, hollow-eyed, his mouth curling into a faint grin before vanishing into the dark. Claire stayed awake the rest of the night, shotgun clutched to her chest, every muscle rigid. When the sun rose, she checked outside. More footprints, bare feet again, circling the cabin. Only this time, they weren't just outside. They led up onto the porch and right to her door. By now, Claire had had enough. She packed her truck, locked the cabin, and drove until she reached town. She told the sheriff what had happened, Sid, but all he did was nod and say the woods had strange people living in them sometimes. When she returned days later with a friend, the cabin looked untouched. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, but on her window, smeared in the dirt from outside, were the faint outlines of two handprints, one on the glass and one on the inside. Claire doesn't live there anymore. She sold the cabin within a year, never telling the new owner what had happened. But sometimes, when she talks about it, she pauses, her voice trembling, and say, "The woods are full of sounds you can explain, but knocking at your window in the middle of the night, that's not the woods." When people think about moving off-grid, they imagine freedom, fresh air, space to breathe, nobody bothering them. That's exactly what Mark thought when he bought his little plot of land in Idaho. It came with a weathered, old hunting cabin that hadn't been touched in years. The roof sagged, the floorboards creaked, and the windows were caked in dust. But to Mark, it was perfect. He told himself he'd fix it up, patch the roof, clean the inside, maybe even build an extension. Simple life, just him and the wilderness. But from the very first night, he realized the cabin wasn't empty. The first sign was small. He carried his boxes inside, set them down, and went back to the truck for more. But when he returned, the boxes weren't where he left them. They were neatly stacked by the fireplace, as if someone had moved them for him. He laughed it off. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he was just remembering wrong. But that night, as he lay in his sleeping bag, the laughter was gone. It started with footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate. They moved across the cabin floor above him, boards groaning under invisible weight. Mark held his breath, frozen. He hadn't even finished exploring the attic yet. There wasn't supposed to be anyone up there. He reached for the flashlight and shined it at the ceiling. The footsteps stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavier than the footsteps themselves. By morning, he convinced himself it had been his imagination. Wood contracts, old cabins creak. The mind plays tricks. But then came the whispers. Mark was sitting by the stove, cooking canned beans, and he heard its faint voices, drifting down from the attic. He couldn't make out the words, only the cadence, low, hushed, like two people speaking in secret. His skin prickled. The attic had no windows, no vents, no way sound could drift in from outside. He forced himself up the ladder, flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam cut across the dust and cobwebs, revealing nothing, just rotting boards and mouse droppings. The whispers stopped the moment he stepped inside. Mark thought about leaving right then, but pride kept him there. He told himself he'd get used to it, that the cabin had character, but the cabin had other plans. A week later, he woke in the middle of the night with the sound of breathing, not his own. Heavy, slow, ragged breaths filled the room. He fumbled for his flashlight, heart slamming against his ribs, and swept the beam across the cabin, not empty, But the moment he turned off the light, breathing started again this time. Right beside him, Mark bolted upright, scrambling out of his sleeping bag. He spent the rest of the night outside in the freezing cold, staring at the cabin door with a shotgun in his lap. The next day, he decided to board up the attic. He hammered nails into the hatch, sealing it shut. If something was in there, it was going to stay in there. That night, he finally felt a little safer, until the scratching began. Long, slow drags of fingernails against wood, coming from directly above his bed. The nails he'd driven into the attic door rattled in their holes as something pushed against it from the other side. Then came the whisper, clear this time, low, deliberate, right above his head. "We see you." Mark barely lasted another 2 nights. On his final morning, he woke to find the attic hatch wide open, the nails bent outward as if something had forced its way down. On the floor beneath it, in the dust, were footprints, bare, human, leading in a slow circle around his bed. And on the wall above the fireplace, scrawled in charcoal, were the words, "Thanks for letting us in." Mark left everything behind: his tools, his boxers, even his truck. He hiked the miles back to the main road and never set foot on that land again. The cabin is still there. Locals say it's cursed, though no one lives close enough to really know. Some claim they've seen a figure in the attic window, watching, waiting. Mark won't talk about it anymore, but a few times he's been pressed, he always says the same thing. The cabin was never empty. Not before me, not after me, and if you're smart, you'll never go inside.